Hey everyone, what's going on? It is A with Anything Goes with A. Hope everyone has been doing well since my last video. Here today, I am looking forward to doing a little bit of a different type of video. I know back at the beginning of the year when I posted my big I'm back announcement, a lot of what I talked about in that video was doing stuff a little bit different than what I had done in the past, especially after coming back from my hiatus that I had taken over the past couple of years, where when I started out, it was a lot of reviews, discussions, videos about watches, all things that I really enjoy doing, but started to feel like I was getting very formulaic on. And today, looking to talk about something that really was an intention of discussing on the channel all along, but really something that I haven't really decided to dive into until today. So back around 2015, 2016, my partner and I were talking about this before I started filming to try and figure out about when I started collecting. I got my first and only record player. And around that time, actually, I purchased my first record before I even had a record player. And since then, I've amassed a very, very small collection, especially in comparison to some very serious record collectors. I've amassed a collection of about 40 different records that I have gotten over time from different stores, from different places, and have just slowly grown this collection. There are certain times where I buy more records than others. Years in the past where I've bought more records than others. I think there are probably years that I've gone where I haven't bought a single record. So what I thought would be fun to do today is not necessarily talk about every single one of those 40 records, but rather spend a little bit of time talking about my first record, my most recent record, and my favorite record. I thought that might be a fun way to kind of take a snapshot of my collection, look at three very different records that are a part of my collection that kind of benchmark where I started, where I've gotten to, and something along the way that I have collected that I really, really enjoy and is one of my favorite records and really one of my favorite albums in general, outside of just being a record that I own, just a collection of music that I really, really enjoy. So today we'll be going ahead and jumping into all of that. We're going to roll the intro and we will be right back to jump right into it. Black Parade by My Chemical Romance. So I mentioned a moment ago in the intro that I actually bought my first record before I even had a record player, and that was the Black Parade by My Chemical Romance. I had always thought that owning a record player would be really cool, a really interesting thing to have, and just a fun way to collect music as opposed to just listening digitally. Don't get me wrong, I listen to plenty of music on Spotify, just like I'm sure many of you do as well, or listen to music on YouTube or whatever. But I thought that getting into actually record collecting and collecting music would be really cool, and vinyl would be a really neat way to do it. Something very purposeful that you kind of need to do, sit down, put on a record. It's something that you kind of need to be at home for usually. And so the Black Parade really kicked that off. I was going through an especially heavy kind of pop punk music listening phase. I've gone through a lot of different music phases over the years. Spent years listening to pop punk, classic rock, hip hop, 90s rap, grunge, hard rock, metal, Viking metal, different kinds of, all sorts of different types of music. And so I was going through an especially heavy pop punk phase. The Black Parade is an album that I always really loved. I've always loved the story that the album has. and it has some really great classic tracks, definitely a pop punk classic. My favorite track on the album, and something that I grew to love even more after I had the album and the more I listened to it, is the track Cancer. I think it's a really, really beautiful song. Really enjoyed it, and The Black Parade by My Chemical Romance was the album to kick off my record collection. For my newest album, we have Good Kid, Mad City by So when I discovered Kendrick Lamar, the most recent album that he had released was Good Kid, Mad City. Now, albeit I was a little bit late to the game, I think that it had probably been out for a little while. I think To Pimp a Butterfly was actually just coming up on being released by the time that I started listening to Good Kid, Mad City. But from the first time I started listening to it, I was totally hooked. It was one of the first hip hop albums that I could think of where I really I don't know if it was just that the story was broken down a little bit more easily to understand than other hip hop albums had been that I had listened to in the past, because of course there were albums that I had listened to before that had stories, but this was one that I really felt like you could listen to track for track, listen to how this young man's life develops, and kind of the decisions that he makes, and what happens in his life, and how it formulates where he's going to go with his life through what happens in the album. It's actually not the first Kendrick Lamar album that I owned on vinyl. The first one that I owned was Damn, which is another great album. All of his albums are fantastic, but just given the fact that Good Kid, Mad City was the first one of his that I had really enjoyed, I really knew that I needed this one on vinyl. It was something that I had been wanting to get for a super long time, but opportunity wasn't right or whatever. Something really important to me is buying records in person. I've actually only ever bought one record online, which is going to be the next one that we're going to talk about. Just because I really like, even if it's from it's not from like a really local record store, even if it's from somewhere like Barnes and Noble, which is a kind of a bookstore chain that happens to sell records, or if it's at Walmart or at Target. There's just something about buying a record in person that I really like, especially if I can get it at a local record store. And even better if it's a local record store while I'm out of town. I always love the additional memory that's added to that piece of music. Maybe I have my own memories that I associate with that music even before I got the record, but then having purchased it somewhere where maybe I was on vacation, visiting a friend or family, or whatever the case may be, then I begin to associate that memory with the record and that piece of music as well. So when I go to put that music on, I then end up thinking about that vacation or whatever the case may be. So Good Kid, Mad City, like I mentioned, one that I had really wanted to pick up for a long time, and it is a really, really fantastic album. Last but not least, we have my favorite album in the whole world, which is Viva La Vida by Coldplay. So I've been listening to Viva La Vida by Coldplay for the better part of 15 years. When I was in sixth grade, I specifically remember, and I was looking back the other day to see specifically when the album came out in 2008. I remember my dad going and buying the album on CD. And he had the CD in his car. He always had stacks of CDs in his car. And he was always really good about, if there was a new popular album that came out, he would get it on CD. He wasn't necessarily a Coldplay fan, so to speak, but if there was a new popular album, probably because of the single Viva La Vida off of the album was the reason that he bought it, he would always go get those CDs. And I remember seeing it in his car and listening to it, and then I actually took that CD and I burned it onto a flash drive. I ripped it onto a flash drive, and I put that flash drive in my Xbox 360. And when I would play Call of Duty 4, the original Modern Warfare, I would play, this was the only album that I had on my Xbox and it was saved on there. So every time that I played Call of Duty, I would listen to this album on loop. And so I think between the fact that it is really a great album, but also the fact that at the when you're in sixth grade, maybe around the age of I don't know how old you are in 6th grade, maybe 10 years old. Such an impressionable age, something so nostalgic, like maybe one of my first video games that I ever really played a lot of, which was Call of Duty 4. Maybe some of you can relate to that. This album was just like ingrained into my mind. And over time, I kind of stopped listening to the album, ended up getting a new console, so I wasn't listening to it on Xbox anymore. And I stopped listening to the album, never necessarily had any kind of dislike for it, just stopped listening to it. And really, I was listening to it so much at the time because of the convenience, the fact that it was just there whenever I was playing games, I would just listen to it. Never really paid attention to the lyrics of the album or anything like that. I was just listening to the music. The music was there, so I was listening to it. But I was learning the songs, and I remember kind of like picking up on the lyrics and memorizing the lyrics and all that kind of stuff. Well, fast forward, I don't know exactly when it was, but there was a point at which I kind of started to listen to the album again and started to rediscover it, so to speak. And at that point, I really discovered that the album has such an incredible story of almost like your title track of Life in Technicolor as like the birth of the album, and then Death and All His Friends as the death of the album and the story of the life that the album lives throughout the entirety of the tracks. I finally had the opportunity to see Coldplay for my first time just last June, or it might have been May of 2022. I had seen them for my first time, which is a really cool thing to do, really cool opportunity to have. It was during their Music of the Spheres tour. I believe that's what the album was called. Outside of Viva La Vida and a couple of their older albums, I don't really keep up a ton with their new music. Certainly no dislike for it, just don't keep up with it quite as much. So I can't remember for sure what the album was called or what the album tour was. And they played, I think, a song or two from Viva La Vida, but would have definitely liked to hear some more. And honestly, there's, for me, not a single skip on the album. I love listening to it all the way through. Such a just tangible album. There's just something about it that when I listen to it, it's like almost like there's just like a feeling that I have as I'm listening to the album. And it's really, really hard to describe, but just something that I really love. I've considered getting tattoos related to this album, probably something I'll do at some point. But yeah, so Viva La Vida or Death and All His Friends by Coldplay, hands down, is my favorite album of all time. And this is the only album that I've ever purchased online. Usually I try and get them in person, like I mentioned before. This was when I was having a lot of trouble finding in person, and it got to the point where I just couldn't not have the album. So I went ahead and I think I ordered it on Amazon or something like that. But it was time. I needed to have it. And certainly not something that I've regretted. Gotten plenty of spins out of it. I will get plenty more. And it is really just an incredible, fantastic album that I have gotten a lot of enjoyment out of owning, but just something that I have loved listening to over the years. Would definitely recommend listening to it if you haven't before. One of my favorite pieces of work that Coldplay has ever put out. So that is, that's my favorite record that I own, Viva La Vida or Death and All His Friends by Coldplay. So as we're wrapping up, I hope you enjoyed hearing about those three albums, their importance to me as my first, most recent, and favorite albums. Feel free to leave any kind of thoughts that you might have down below. If you currently collect records, or if you collect music, whether it be CDs or tapes or records, or if you just really like listening to music on YouTube or Spotify or even on the radio potentially, feel free to go ahead and drop some of that down below. If you're a fan of any of the music that I mentioned, definitely feel free to mention down in the comments if you have anything that you want to mention, suggestions of things that I should listen to. And also, if you enjoyed this type of video where I'm talking about some kind of different content, but also just something related more to my kind of interests and passions outside of just fashion and jewelry and watches, definitely let me know as well, so that way I can kind of get an idea of maybe what might be good content for videos in the future. So this has been Anything Goes with A. Really looking forward to seeing you all again soon, and until next time, have a great rest of your day.